Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover Donald Trump's major announcement from earlier this week that one of his first acts as president will be to impose 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports, including how Canadian policymakers ought to be thinking about the threat. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
A lot of us anticipated that if Canada was to be affected by Trump's tariffs, it would be likely as collateral damage or an inadvertent consequence. Now we discover that we're actually a primary target. David, what do you make of this announcement? How are we to understand the disproportionate focus on Canada?
Yeah. Well, this announcement is Canada and Mexico jointly. And I think it's still true that Mexico is front of Trump's mind because he did talk about fentanyl and migration, which are real challenges to the United States on the southern border. On the northern border, it must be stressed, the threat of illegal immigration is from the United States into Canada. People who are afraid of being rounded up and deported are going to be pressing up against the Canadian border, and it's the United States that poses this challenge to Canada. But Canada and the United States, sorry, Canada and Mexico are jointly in the target as target one, with China strangely subordinate. I think Canadian policymakers must take this extremely seriously. Donald Trump has been on many sides of the abortion issue. He's been on many sides of the immigration issue. He's had all kinds of views on gay rights and transgender. Since he began exploring a presidential run in the 1980s, he wanted to run for president in 1988.
Yes.
One constant in his political career has been his dislike and distrust of international trade. He announced his 1988 run by buying a full-page ad in the New York Times in 1987, denouncing trade with, in those days, Japan and South Korea were the targets. But the same concept that that international economics is zero sum. There are winners, there are losers, there are no gains from trade, there's no mutual benefit. It must be stopped. That has been with him through his career because it reflects deep things in his own psychology. He himself in business is a predator. He is never in. If you lend to Donald Trump, if you do business with Donald Trump, you lose. It's a mistake. He wins, you lose. And that's how he approaches every economic problem.
I want to take up your point about the basis of these proposed tariffs, in particular the claim that Canada and Mexico are a major source of drugs and illegal migrants. How do you interpret that claim? Is it a legitimate argument in search of some sort of policy response from Canada, or is it a trumped up pretext to justify, as you say, what Trump's instinct is anyway?
Look, there is both. It is both pretext and legitimate. It's pretext because the basis for doing business and the vast complexity of relationships of North America between which is a trilateral relationship with Mexico as an equal. Mexico is now, by the way, America's largest trade partner, bigger than China,
Yes.
bigger than Canada. The way you manage this is by having separate files. So when you are trying to deal with water cleanliness issues, you don't muddy the waters by
Yes.
linking it to trade. You say we have to, we negotiate on the water cleanliness, air quality, migration of people, because all of these issues require cooperation. Trump's view, his hostile and predatory view of international relations means he doesn't understand or he doesn't accept that if either Mexico is a partner in the illegal migration problem or the problem is literally unsolvable. An indifferent or hostile Mexico, the problem can't be dealt with. Mexico has to be a partner. And you don't get partners by bullying and threatening. You get partners by working together. But it is a pretext because Trump, I think, wants to bust up NAFTA anyway. He campaigned. One of the points that people make is, well, look, this is his own treaty that he's now inveighing against. But remember, he campaigned in 2016 against NAFTA, period. And
Yes.
while the USMCA treaty in 2019-2020 made NAFTA more protectionist against the outside world, his core grievance against NAFTA, which is free trade with Canada and Mexico, that's a feature of that agreement. So I think it's pretty clear he wants to bring it to an end. And while there's some doubt about his exact power to impose these tariffs, he can probably do it. He can certainly withdraw from NAFTA if he wants to, and that's something it looks like he's minded to do.
We'll come to that point in a minute, but I want to dwell on the question of motivation and how Canadian policymakers should understand it. From the day that Trump was elected up until the moment that we're speaking, there's been an underlying assumption in a lot of Canadian commentary that Trump's threat of tariffs are principally should be principally understood as a bargaining chip and part of a broader bilateral or trilateral negotiation. To what extent is that still the right operating assumption? Or, as you've just set out, is there something else, perhaps much bigger, going on here?
I want to draw people's attention to an important thread by Erin O'Toole, former leader of the Conservative Party, who offered what you call the traditional solution to a problem like a blustery American president. And O'Toole listed a series of concessions that Canada might make, things that Canada can do to prove its goodwill. And this is a way that Canadians are very comfortable dealing with the United States. I think a lot of Canadians, especially Canadian conservatives, capital C, tend to assume in trade disputes between Canada and the United States is probably in the right. Canada is trying to do something statist and interventionist,
Yes.
and the Americans are protesting against it. And the access to the American market is so important. And the thing that the Canadian negotiators is defending is inefficient and stupid. So the way you start looking for concessions you can make to the Americans, Canadian conservatives want to raise defense spending anyway, so why don't you repackage that as a concession to the Americans? Do what you want to do anyway and treat it as a concession. That's the capital T traditionalist attitude. If, as you say, Trump is serious about these tariffs, that this is ideological for him, if, as our friend Rutger Griffiths has been pointing out, that Trump's fiscal plans require new sources of revenue, and tariffs could be a source of revenue for them, then Canada is in a very uncharted area and a kind of a world that Canada has not seen since before the Second World War, since the Great Depression, since the Herbert Hoover days.
Yes.
And the path of concession is not going to work because these tariffs are ideologically driven, they're fiscally necessary, they reflect a new American indifference to continental and global leadership. It's a much more radical problem, and therefore you have to contemplate much more radical solutions than pro-American Canadians and conservative Canadians have historically been comfortable with.
We'll come to what we might do about the threat understood in these terms in a minute, but I just want to stay on the subject of the underlying ideological assumptions. David, you've spent a lot of time in the world of American conservatism. One thing that I've noticed in recent years is an increasing focus on production. Think of someone like Orrin Cass, an economic thinker with some influence in
Yeah.
Trump circles, who's argued that American economic policy is focused too much on individuals as consumers and not sufficiently as focused on production. There's another line of argument that the U.S. economy is over-indexed for what you might describe as the intangible economy and not focused sufficiently on the goods-producing part of the economy. To what extent should we understand these tariffs as an effort to re-domicile production that has
Yeah.
been distributed geographically across North America in the NAFTA era? In other words, there was an assumption that the focus here was to re-domicile production in North America, and it seems to me what we're discovering is that there's an interest in re-domiciling production from North America into the United States.
Yeah. I'm going to say something even more disturbing. And I think the way to understand MAGA politics is it's fundamentally sexual politics. It's about the role of the man in the world, the role of the man in the United States. Social conservatives talk about re-domiciling production. They're not interested in re-domiciling film production. They're not interested in re-domiciling advertising and software.
Yes.
They want to re-domicile the kind of production that increases the value of male labor to rebalance the sexual economy of the United States. Back in the olden days, it was always true that women were more likely to get formal schooling than men. This idea that when we point out that women are more likely to finish college, well, women used to be more likely to finish high school back in the days when most people only did high school. But what happened in 1958 was the girl would finish high school, the boy might not or might just barely. He'd get a unionized job. She'd get a secretarial or clerical job, or retail job, and he would earn more than her. And so even if he was kind of no bargain, from an emotional point of view, that a sexual bargain would take place because he could provide and she needed him. And I think a lot of MAGA is about restoring the scarcity value of male labor and depressing the value of female labor to right the balance between the sexes and get the kind of families that, for highly ideological reasons, they want. Now, it has to be said, the people in those families don't necessarily want this, but it is wanted for them. It's, in my opinion, a repressive and reactionary project. And I say this as someone who's pretty socially conservative, and yet it scares me. This is not the way I would want to proceed because it treats people like experimental objects rather than, autonomous individuals with their own lives to lead. But that's what, because otherwise, why is manufacturing so valuable? I mean, here's a question about manufacturing. If you go into a building and assemble bread on an assembly line, bread and burger patties and cheese and tomato and lettuce into a finished product, is that manufacturing? Yes or no? And people would say no. Well, why not? Why is that different from assembling ingots into a thingamajig? And the answer is, well, because it's basically what we imagine when we are thinking. We're imagining men on the assembly line earning a unionized wage that is made artificially high by artificial scarcities that will then increase their value as marriage partners. That's what J.D. Vance and Orrin Cass are all about. I mean, I think, as I say, I think it's a non-economic project. I think it's a reactionary project. I think it's a repressive project, but that's the project. And we have to start there. And meanwhile, the people who have this project do not care about American international leadership. They don't care about having a secure frontier with Mexico. In fact, many of them talk openly about waging war, shooting war inside Mexico. They want to go to war with the cartels. Well, they'll say that's not a war against Mexico. It's just a war inside Mexico without the permission of the Mexican government. But it's a real war, and a real war, by the way, where the cartels can strike back inside the United States. So I'm roaming around here a little bit, but I think we just need to take. I love Aaron O'Toole. What a good-natured person, and what good advice his advice would be if you were dealing with the first Reagan term when the dollar got high and they began doing some protectionist thing, or the Nixon administration when they did some experiment. But in all of those cases, these were free trade administrations doing some protectionism to cope with a domestic political problem. We have an ideologically committed, protectionist, socially reactionary administration, and you need to take that on board and develop some leverage against that problem, not against the problems you used to have.
Yeah, what insight, David. I would say that I think one of the resistance to understanding the threat in those terms is that it leads to the inevitable conclusion that there's no simple way out. If you accept that the tariffs aren't a bargaining chip, but instead reflect an end in and of themselves, it leaves us in the unenviable position of having to plan for the distinct possibility that we're stuck with costly new barriers to the American market without much recourse.
No,
Uh,
it leads to an even more disturbing conclusion than that, I'm sorry to say, because
please.
there are recourses. No, so it means we have to realign how Canadian politics works. So in the basic grammar of Canadian politics, dating back to Confederation, was that those people who wanted a more free market approach to Canada internally tended to advocate concessions to the United States. This goes back to the reciprocity election of 1911.
Yes.
This goes back a long time, and so
Yes.
the true free marketeers would say the Americans are allies and friends. Their grievances are mostly pretty legitimate, and we need to work with them. And where there are frictions, Canada can allay them by, since Canada is normally the more protectionist partner, Canada can meet American objections by Canadian concessions, which are going to be in the long term in the Canadian interest. We are now in a world where the people who are marketeers have to get ready for a tougher approach to the United States. And the people who are going to want a softer approach to the United States are going to be the less marketeers because they're going to welcome the opportunity for Canada to have a more state-led economy. Because one of the things you do about American protectionism is make Canada more state-led. And that also is a pattern that goes way back in Canadian history. So Canada needs to develop leverage across, it needs to precisely to do what the United States is falsely accusing it of, which is start finding linkages and finding ways to damage. This is not cost-free, the damage will be to Canada too, but in areas of security, in areas of counterterrorism, in areas of drug proliferation. Now, Canada needs to say, Americans take for granted, and of course they should, Um, Now, it's awful to talk about this because
Yes.
what I keep comparing this is like a couple that is having some marital difficulties, beginning to consult the divorce lawyers. You start a process that is very difficult to call back, and you start contemplating things that once you've contemplated them are very difficult to stop thinking about and should never have been thought in the first place. But in self-defense, Canada is going to have to contemplate some very different things from what it's contemplated in the past. And Canadian politics, domestic politics, will need to look quite different in return. And one of the very specific dangers that Canadian conservatives face is it will be dangerous to be seen as the party of conciliation with the Americans if the Americans are Trump.
It prompts the question, what is your advice to Canadian policymakers? What should they be doing or thinking? And how, for instance, would you recommend they handle the Mexico question, which is looming large in Canadian politics in recent days?
Well, you and I have talked about this a couple of times, and the first time we talked about it, I'm going to confess, I did something when I don't know the answer, I restate the problem in fancier terms. And I did that. I sort of restated the problem. But I've been thinking about it for 2 straight weeks. Because the question is, should Canada separate its fate from Mexico's, or should Canada join its fate to Mexico's?
Yes.
And and I recalled when we asked the question the first time how in the 1980s, many Canadians, me among them, had
Yes.
not wanted Mexico in the US-Canada agreement because we
Yes.
wanted to go for fully free movement of capital, fully free movement of people, and that was impossible with Mexico as a partner. That all became moot. I think I've thought my way to the position Canada has to link its fate to Mexico's.
Hmm.
Because as unlovely as the present Mexican administration is, as statist and authoritarian and reactionary in its turn as it is, if we're going to save free continental trade in the context of open trade links to the rest of the world, that is not a fortress North America, but a North America that trades in perfect freedom internally and substantial freedom externally, and that could maybe even someday do things like negotiate a carbon treaty with the European Union and Britain and Japan. The Mexicans have to be made allies in that project because otherwise the Americans play divide and conquer against the two, and you get a fortress United States. So it's going to be difficult to do that diplomacy with Mexico. But I would urge full partnership with Mexico to try to develop a common answer with the Mexicans against the Trump administration,
Hmm.
to save NAFTA as best we can save it, to save continental commerce, to save the free trade ideal. Understanding the Mexicans too are very imperfect partners in this effort. But with them, perhaps there's a way to play for time and remember, and to get us to the point where Congress becomes less sympathetic to Trump. Remember, it looks like the Republicans are going to have a 4 vote majority in the House of Representatives, of which 2 seats are empty.
Yes.
So until there are special elections called for the next months, they have a 2 vote majority in the House of Representatives. And half a dozen of the people in the Republican Congress are just completely ungovernable. So they have no majority. So Trump is going to have difficulty getting things through the House. Now on tariffs, unfortunately, there are a number of Democrats who are tariff friendly, or at least tariff curious. So he may have more success building a bipartisan coalition on tariffs than anything else. But it's going to be a little more difficult for him on much of his agenda than he thought, or observers thought a week ago.
I want to take up your point about the free trade ideal, David. I must say that I've felt more disillusioned in the past few days than I felt in a long time, perhaps as long back as when Donald Trump's first elected in 2016. And that's because one increasingly gets the sense that we're living through a moment here in which deference to markets is increasingly being replaced by a kind of raw power
Yeah.
political economy. Do you think that's hyperbole at this stage? And either way, how does a country like Canada respond if we are indeed entering an intellectual and political environment like that?
Yeah. Um, I think we are entering that. I think we're being pushed there by the Trump administration, but obviously he's found a resonance inside American politics. The free trade ideal is one that goes against many human instincts. For 10,000 years, if your neighbor had something that you wanted, for 100,000, for as long as we've been beings, the most obvious and direct way was to go kill him and take it. And through most of human society, if your neighbor had something you wanted, that was what you did. And it became, facades of the Romans and the others put some facades of civilization and Corinthian columns on it. But that was basically your neighbor had something you wanted, go kill him, go take it. But along the way, there have been voices that say, well, what if you made something that your neighbor wanted and you freely exchanged for it? That would never work. And we get this big test. The big tests are in the Great World Wars of the century, where Nazism and stuff, they are just the most savage and murderous and technologically advanced idea. Your neighbor has something you want, kill him and take it. And out of that horror, many people around the world said, this other idea, I mean, it's so crazy, but the kill him and take it approach has really signally failed. Why don't we try the make something your neighbor wants and freely exchange? And by God, that did work, as improbable as it sounded. And for 50 years, the world got richer and richer and richer. What if your neighbor had something you wanted, you made something that he wanted, and you swapped it back and forth, and you were both better off. And by the way, there was no violence, or you reduced violence. There was less killing. But that the instinct, club them, take it, is always there. And I'm going to say something a little, I mean, it's kind of, my kids laugh at me at this, where I say, I think free trade is the most romantic ideal there is. But one of the things the Trump administration has done, or the Trump era has done to many of us who have grown up on the right, is forced us to accept we have to choose our priorities. Because a lot of things that I believe in no longer exist in one ideological package. And you have to choose which is the most important thing. There was a story today, or on the day that you and I record, there's a story in the Wall Street Journal about the Trump administration making some effort to get rid of racial preferences in education, which is something I would normally support. And by the way, if they do it, I will welcome that. That will be one of the positive things to come out of the second Trump administration. But compared to keeping alive the free trade ideal, it's less important. And I mean, there's just this, except for actually literally preventing nuclear war, maybe there's nothing more important than keeping alive the ideal of free exchange of commerce between nations, because it's how you defend free markets at home. It's also how you secure peace and international cooperation abroad.
There's been a ton of sober reflection in our conversation, David, that our audience, particularly those in Canadian policymaking circles, need to hear. If you'll permit me, in search of optimism,
Yeah.
may I ask you to reflect today as we approach the Thanksgiving weekend here in the United States? You're in Brooklyn. I'm speaking to you from Manhattan. May I ask for some thoughts as Americans across the country gather for Thanksgiving?
Yeah. Um, I wrote an article for The Atlantic, this is my most recent one, which pointed out that there have been dark times before. There have been dark times in American history before. Um, I'll say this is something in a Canadian context. Do you know this? There's a Civil War song called Marching Through Georgia. And one of the lyrics is, hurrah, hurrah, uh, marching to the sea, we bring the flag, we carry the flag that sets you free.
Hmm.
For the first 75 years of the country's history, the flag that was not a flag that set you free.
Yes.
If you were in a slave ship on the seas and you saw a ship with an American flag, that meant you were being transported onward to slavery. It was only if you saw a British flag that you might be set free. So there have been dark periods in American history before, and the period, between 1935 and 1941 of the Neutrality Acts, when America just said, we don't care if Hitler and Stalin divide the world, and we could stop it, but we won't. That's a period sort of like now. I do believe William Seward, who was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, said, I believe we will discover enough public virtue to save the country. I'm going to paraphrase, Mike. I don't remember the exact quote. I believe we will discover enough public virtue to save the country. We just may not have any left over. And so this is going to be a very close run. But maintaining the international free trade order, maintaining collective security is maintaining American global leadership. And Americans need to understand that their global leadership has been trusted by a lot of people all over the world, and it's made a better world. It's made America richer and safer too, but it's made a better world. And Trump is proposing not just to abdicate from it, but to wreck it.
Uh, that's a good place to wrap up. David, on behalf of the entire Hub community, happy Thanksgiving to you and your family, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Bye bye.